Welcome to another Through the Bible teaching. We are now in Genesis chapter 43. And I've said this a lot, but man, I love the teaching about Joseph. God has used him in my life in a big way. So I've got all of my footnotes here on my living commentary, this computer. This is a computer program where I've written footnotes on over 28,000 verses in the Bible. And these footnotes go into more detail than what I'm doing as we go through this. If I was to just follow everything and look up every verse and every footnote that I reference in here, I'd be covering 3 or 4 verses per hour instead of, I think we're covering close to 40 or 50 verses per hour. So I do have a expiration date. I cannot cover every verse in this same detail and get through the entire Bible in my lifetime. So please get hold of this. I've also got a teaching on Joseph. I've got a book on it. I've got CDs, DVDs, and a USB. And this is just awesome. So we've already covered a lot of things. This is about Joseph and about how he was sold into slavery, and yet for 13 years he remained faithful to God. He became the second in command over the mightiest nation on the planet, probably the second most powerful man on the planet. And one of the greatest things about Joseph that I really emphasized in the 41st chapter was that after Joseph had complete power, and he could have taken the armies of Egypt and he could have gone and made his brothers bow down to him, and he could have made those 2 dreams that came in Genesis chapter 37 verse 2. He could have made them come to pass. He didn't do a thing in the flesh to make God's will come to pass. He just served the Lord faithfully in the position that God had promoted him to, and he waited on God to bring it to pass. That's awesome. So in the 42nd chapter is where his brothers came down to Egypt to buy corn, and Joseph recognized them. He was 17 years old when they sold him into slavery. He's now 39 years old. They didn't recognize him, but he recognized them. And he spoke roughly to them and said they were spies. And for 3 days, he put them into prison and kept them in prison. And some people interpret this as him doing this out of vengeance. He did it because he was bitter. He was wanting to hurt his brothers as much as he had been hurt. I reject that 100%. That is completely inconsistent with everything that the scripture here is revealing about Joseph. Joseph, when he saw his brothers bow down to him, it was more than just physically bowing the knee. He saw their heart had to bow to God. And these were ungodly people who had committed multiple murders, over 100 people murdered in cold blood, incest committed by Reuben and Judah. And they were just evil, ungodly men. And God was trying to bring them to the end of themselves. And this is the way he did it, was through Joseph. Joseph wasn't doing these things maliciously. He was doing it in love for his brothers. And as we continue through this chapter and the next chapter, you'll be able to see that clearly, that his actions here weren't out of vengeance. It wasn't out of wrath. He was being used by God to let these brothers recognize that you could not live the life that you live and get by with it. Be sure your sins will find you out. I think that's Numbers chapter 32, verse 23. So in chapter 43, it says in verse 1, and the famine was sore in the land. This is the brothers had already gone back home to Canaan, and they had told the father that Joseph, the Lord of the land, had said, the only way you can prove that you aren't spies is to bring this brother that you spoke about back and show him to me, and then I will believe that you aren't spies. And yet Jacob would not let Benjamin leave his sight because he was the last surviving son of Rachel, and he just would not. He says, I refuse to let Benjamin go. So that's what all of this background to this is. But they were running out of food, and they had to go back and get more food. So in verse 2 it says, and it came to pass when they had eaten up the corn which they had brought out of Egypt, their father said unto them, go again, buy us a little food. You know, again, this is not logical on Jacob's part. He knew that they had gotten in trouble the first time. He knew that they had to bring back Benjamin, but he was in a situation where something had to be done, and so he was telling them to go back without doing what the Lord of the land, Joseph, had told them to do. It was irrational but he was just in a situation where he had no other choice. And in verse 3 it says, And Judah spake unto him, saying, The man did solemnly protest unto us, saying, Ye shall not see my face, except your brother be with you. If thou wilt send our brother with us, we will go down and buy thee food. But if thou wilt not send him, we will not go down. For the man said unto us, Ye shall not see my face, except your brother be with you. So they knew that Joseph had the power to kill them, to put them into prison, to make them slaves or whatever. And they knew that there was no way that they could appear before him without Benjamin. And so they just refused to obey their father without taking Benjamin with them. And in verse 6, And Israel said, Wherefore dealt ye so ill with me as to tell the man whether he had yet a brother? And of course, these brothers, their response in verse 7, they said, The man asked us straightly of our state and of our kindred, saying, Is your father yet alive? This is a piece of information that they didn't give in the previous chapter, but here they are repeating it. And apparently Joseph had also not only asked about Benjamin, but he asked about Jacob as well. So he asked us straightly of our kindred, saying, Is your father yet alive? Have ye another brother? And we told him, according to the tenor of these words, could we certainly know that he would say, Bring your younger brother down. And so in other words, they're saying that we didn't know what he was going to ask. We were just telling him these things. And so Judah said unto them in verse 8, Judah said unto Israel, his father, Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and thou and our little ones. I will be surety for him. Of my hand shalt thou require him. I will bring him, if I bring him not unto thee and set him before thee, then let me bear the shame forever. This is very similar to what Reuben said in the previous chapter about kill my two sons if I don't bring Benjamin back to you. He couldn't guarantee that he could bring Benjamin back. That was a stupid thing to say. It was an oath that he couldn't fulfill. And here's Judah, not necessarily saying the exact same thing, but it's similar in the sense that I'll bear the judgment. It'll be a spot on me. It'll be against me and my descendants for the rest of our life. That's a stupid thing to say. He had no control over Joseph and how Joseph would respond. And so they were just promising things that they couldn't deliver on just because their situation was so desperate, and they had to have Benjamin with them in order to go back down. So in verse 10, Judah said this, he said, For except we had lingered, surely now we had returned this second time. What this is saying is that unless they had delayed doing what Joseph told them to do, they would have already returned with Benjamin. So the time had already lapsed, and they knew that they already could be in trouble with the man who was ruling the land, which was Joseph. In verse 11 it says, And their father Israel said unto them, If it must be so now, do this, take of the best fruits of the land in your vessels, and carry down the man a present, a little balm and a little honey, spices and myrrh, and take double money in your hand, and the money that was brought again in the mouth of your sacks, carry it again in your hand. Peradventure, it was an oversight. And so basically, Judah had promised that he would guarantee it, but he couldn't guarantee it. But finally, Jacob came to a place to recognize that we've got to have the food or we're going to die. And so he said, take the best of the fruit and the things that we do have and offer it as a present. This goes along with Proverbs chapter 18, verse 16, about a man's gift makes room for him and brings him before great men. This was a custom of the East, and that isn't talking about your anointing. It's talking about a gift. A tangible gift will turn people's hearts, and it will earn you favor with people and bring you before great men. And so he was taking that principle and putting it into practice and telling his sons to take this present. Hopefully it would appease him. You know, this is exactly what Jacob did when Esau came against him with 400 men. He sent all of these gifts, I mean, hundreds of cattle and sheep and all of these things as a gift to Esau. And Esau was coming with 400 men. He had already promised that he would kill Jacob when he could. And the only reason that he had 400 men with him is because he was planning on carrying this out. And yet these gifts that Jacob had given softened Esau's heart, so that when they finally met, Esau ran and fell on his neck and hugged him and totally forgave him. So he had already used gifts to change his brother Esau's heart. Now he's wanting to use gifts to change this ruler over Egypt's heart. And that's what he's talking about. In verse 13, take also your brother and arise, go again unto the man, and God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may send away your other brother and Benjamin, talking about Simeon and Benjamin. If I be bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. And again, I could spend a lot more time talking about this, but did you know what? Some people are so fearful of things happening that they won't do anything. And it just paralyzes them, and they just are afraid to do anything. Did you know that life is risky? And eventually you just have to do what is the right thing to do. This was the only option that Jacob had. They were going to starve if they didn't get this, but he was not wanting to do it, and he held on just as long as he could. But finally he came to this place that I've got to do something, lest it's like those 4 lepers that were at the gate of the city of Samaria, and they said, how long are we going to sit here till we die? If we stay here, we're going to die. If we go into the city, there's a famine there, we're going to die. Let's go out to the Syrians and see what they will do with us. Sooner or later, you just have to recognize that there is risk in obeying God and doing anything with your life, and you've got to get up and go on. And like Jacob is saying right here, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. In other words, everybody's going to die if we stay here. I'm going to have to take the risk. I'm going to have to send Benjamin down there. And if I lose Benjamin, and if I lose Simeon, if I lose all the rest of my children, well, then that's the way that it is. But he just had to do something. And whether you recognize it or not, inaction is not an option. Sometimes people think it is, and they just keep kicking the can down the road and thinking that somehow or another things are going to change and that they won't have to deal with problems. Man, I just hate that attitude. When I see a problem, I'll pray about it and ask God to intervene, maybe even ask God to send somebody else. But sooner or later, once I see that this problem isn't getting better, I'll deal with it. I just hate this attitude of just hoping that things somehow or another disappear, that things get better over time. Things don't get better over time. You need to confront your problems, and you need to do what's the right thing. And again, I see this with Jacob right here. I believe that this is the wrong attitude, but he finally came to a place to where he just had to do what was right, and regardless of what the consequences are, I'm going to do it. There are so many people that evaluate what they are going to do based on what they think the consequences are. That's a terrible way to live. You need to have a relationship with God to where you do what God tells you to do, regardless of what the potential consequences are. I've talked about that before, but man, that's a powerful truth. You cannot always have your finger in the air checking public opinion, which way the wind's blowing, and depending on how people respond, that's going to influence how you act. No, you need to have a plumb line of what is right and wrong. You're going to do what God tells you to do, and regardless of the consequences, you just do it. In verse 15, it says, and the man took that present, talking about all of these spices and all of the things that they had from the land. They took that present and they took double money in their hand and Benjamin, and rose up and went down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. You know, this is a little bit of an aside, but I've thought about this, that Benjamin, because his father, Jacob, had thought that Joseph was dead, he had been smothering Benjamin. He would not let Benjamin out of his sight. And I suspect that Benjamin lived a very sheltered life. And for him to go down to the mightiest nation on the earth at that time and to be traveling and going away from his father and stuff, this must have been really exciting for Benjamin to finally get out from under the thumb of his father and go down to Egypt and see what was going on. And then in verse 16 it says, and when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said unto the ruler of his house, bring these men home and slay and make ready, for these men shall dine with me at noon. And the man did as Joseph bade, and the man brought the man into Joseph's house. And look at the response that his brothers had. In verse 18, the men were afraid because they were brought into Joseph's house, And they said, because of the money that was returned in our sacks at the first time are we brought in, that he may seek occasion against us. And they came near to the steward of Joseph's house, and they communed with him at the door of the house. And they said, O sir, we came indeed down at the first time to buy food. And it came to pass when we came to the end that we opened our sacks, and behold, every man's money was in the mouth of his sack, our money in full weight, and we have brought it again in our hand. In other words, there's no reason for them to do this except that they just realized that they were in a bind. They realized that they had been falsely accused of being spies. They realized that one of their brothers was being held in prison. They recognized that this man had already been upset at them one time, and they were just afraid. They even said previously that what is God doing to us? I think that they were recognizing that their sins were coming, to bear. They were coming to fruit. They were reaping what they've sown, and they were humbling themselves, is what this is. They were admitting something that they didn't have to admit. And so this shows you that there was already beginning to be a change in their heart, and they were trying to come clean. They were trying to be transparent. They were trying to be honest, which was not something that they were known for in the past. And so the manager of Joseph's house said this in verse 22, they said, well, they brought other money down. And in verse 23, it says, and he said, peace be to you, fear not, your God and the God of your father hath given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money, and he brought Simon out to them. Now, again, you got to remember in these days that people had multiple gods and things like this, and so it wasn't unusual for people to talk about God, but this servant of Joseph was saying, your God and the God of your father hath given you this treasure. So this shows a couple of things. It shows that this servant had probably been told by Joseph of his faith in God, and he was aware that Joseph was worshiping the one true God that we serve, not the many gods of the Egyptians, and that's reflected in what he's saying. But also this was probably quite a statement to these brothers, to recognize that this man was talking about their God, the God of their fathers, which would have been Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that he had given them favor. And then when he told them that I'm the one that put the money back in the mouth of your sack, boy, they must have been shocked, like, what is happening? How could this happen? Why would they have done that? And as it goes on, it shows that they thought that maybe this was a way of gaining an accusation against them. It probably made them fear even more of what could happen to them. And so in verse 24, it says, and the man brought the men unto Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet, and he gave their asses provender. And they made ready the present against Joseph came at noon, for they heard that they should eat bread there. And when Joseph came home, they brought him the present which was in their hand unto the house, and bowed themselves to him to the earth. And so they brought all of these spices and all of these things that Jacob had sent, and notice that they bowed themselves to the earth. This is the second time that these brothers had bowed to him. This is the first time that all 11 of Jacob's brothers had bowed to him. And this again is the fulfillment of that dream, but it's more than just bowing the knee. They hadn't yet come to the place of just total repentance for the way that they had lived. And so Joseph hasn't, lessened the pressure on them. A matter of fact, in this very chapter, he just increases it because they still hadn't come to the place that Joseph thought they needed to be. So they bowed themselves to the earth, and this is the second time that they had done that. In verse 27, it says, and he asked them of their welfare and said, is your father well? The old man of whom you spake, is he yet alive? And of course, they didn't realize that this was Joseph asking about his father, but Joseph was longing after his father and wondering how things had been with him over the last 22 years. And in verse 28, and they answered, thy servant our father is in good health. He is yet alive. And they bowed down their heads and made obeisance. This is the third time that these brothers who said that he would never rule over us, we will never bow down to them. This is the third time that they have bowed down to Joseph. And it says that they made obeisance to him. That means to depress or to prostrate, especially reflective in homage to royalty or to God. Man, this is awesome. I just love the way that the Lord does things. He has a way of bringing us to the end of ourself. These people who thought they were so awesome that they could stop Joseph's dreams from coming to pass. Let's kill him and see what will be of his dreams. Here they are bowing down to the very one that they hated. That's awesome. In verse 29, and he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your younger brother of whom you spake unto me? And he said, God be gracious unto thee, my son. Now Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold into slavery. It doesn't tell us how long after that Benjamin was born, but he was younger than that. So Benjamin could have been, I don't know, an early teenager or maybe even before he reached his teens. And he would have changed so much that Joseph wouldn't have recognized him by sight. But since he was with the other 10 brothers, he just supposed this should be Benjamin. So he asked about it. In verse 30, and Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother, and he sought where to weep, and he entered into his chamber and wept there. Well, what effect must this have had on these brothers? Because he was treating them very generously right now and being very kind to them, brought them into his own home. I'm sure it was a palace, and brought him into there, and they were eating with him, which was an honor that they didn't feel like they deserved, and it made them question what was going on. And now, as they revealed Benjamin to him, Joseph ran out of the room weeping. How much this affected them. And we don't know for sure if the household of Joseph and of all of the servants there, if they had been told what the situation was with Joseph and with his brethren. It's possible that they had. And if they had known this, well, then they would have understood what was happening. If they didn't know that these were Joseph's brothers, and if they didn't know the full situation, then how would this have affected all of the people that were in Joseph's house to see him respond this way? They could have wondered, what is going on? We don't know the details of all of this. In verse 31, it says, he washed his face and went out and refrained himself and said, set on bread. And in verse 32, they set on for him by himself, and for them by themselves, and for the Egyptians which did eat with him by themselves, because the Egyptians might not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination unto the Egyptians. So this is again a piece of information that if you don't study the Word, if you just read through this and don't think about it, it lessens the miracle of what God did, because Hebrews were an abomination to the Egyptians. And here Joseph was 9 years into being the second most powerful man in the entire land of Egypt, and yet he still could not have his Hebrew servants and friends eat with him, because it was an abomination to eat with the Hebrews. So that makes it an even greater miracle that a race that was despised and they were prejudiced against, that Pharaoh would have put him second in command over all of these people. This is amazing. And I tell you, many times people just read through and they miss these things, but this is important. And so he was eating by himself, his servants were eating by themselves, and then all of the brothers, the 11 brothers, were eating by themselves. And in verse 33 it says, and they set before him the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, and the men marveled one at another. Again, this is something that people just pass over and they don't think about it. But why did they marvel? Because of the way that they were seated in Joseph's house at his table. It was because they were seated according to their exact birth order. Reuben, then Simeon, then Levi, then Judah, and right on down all the way to Benjamin. How did the people that were serving them know the order of the birth of all of these people? See, that's the significance of this verse. This is why it says they marveled one at another. What were they marveling at? They were saying, how does he know who is the oldest? Who's the firstborn? Who's the secondborn? If they were paying attention, they were beginning to recognize that something is going on here that is just not normal. And this probably cause fear in them that he knows more about us than we want them to know. In verse 34, and he took and sent messes unto them before him. In other words, Joseph was the one that dished out the food and sent each plate of food to the brothers. And it says, but Benjamin's mess was 5 times as much as any of theirs, and they drank and were merry with him. Did you know the word drank right here? It means to imbibe, literally or figuratively, and some of the other translations, it goes on to say here that they made merry, and the word merry here means to become tipsy in a qualified sense, to satiate with a stimulating drink or influence. And so this is talking about that they ate and they drank with him and made merry until they got tipsy. They were beginning to really feel good about themselves. They were on the verge of being drunk. But the reason he sent 5 times as much to Benjamin is because Benjamin was the only brother that was full blood, that did not participate in all of the things that the other 10 brothers did. And Joseph just loved him above all of the other brothers. And so he honored him by sending him 5 times as much food as anybody else. So get a picture of this. Here's all of these brothers, and they are shocked that they are in the house of the second most important person on the planet at that time. They're already fearful, wondering what is happening. They recognize that their money has been put back in their sack's mouth. They are just, they are vulnerable, wondering what's happening. And now they're all seated in the proper birth order. And here's the youngest son that is given 5 times as much food as anybody else. What is going on? I'm sure these brothers were shocked. And so that brings us to the end of the 43rd chapter, and I now have only 1,146 chapters to go in our study verse by verse through the Bible.